The Pine Ridge National Park loomed like a fortress of ancient green, its dense forest whispering secrets only the wind dared carry. The air was crisp, the kind that promised a perfect weekend escape from the chaos of city life. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her pack, glancing at her friends as they gathered around the trailhead. "Ready for an adventure?" Jake grinned, his camera swinging from his neck, capturing every candid moment of their pre-hike excitement. "Only if you promise not to dangle off cliffs for a photo this time," Emily quipped, her smile softening her words. She always carried an undercurrent of warmth, a natural nurturer. Mark laughed, giving Jake a playful shove. "I'll make sure he behaves. Someone's got to keep things competitive." Lisa hung back slightly, her notebook peeking out from her jacket pocket. She was quietly observing, as always, cataloging the day's events in her mind, if not yet on paper. Her pen rested behind her ear, ready to record every step of the journey. Sarah did another head count, a force of habit for someone used to managing people. 5. They were 5. It was her way of anchoring herself, ticking off the list of names in her head. Sarah, Jake, Emily, Mark, Lisa. The first few miles were uneventful, filled with laughter and banter as they followed the winding path deeper into the park. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the forest floor. The group stopped to admire a clearing where the golden light filtered through the canopy, Jake capturing the moment with his lens. "Can't wait to write about this," Lisa murmured, more to herself than anyone else. As the light faded, the mood shifted. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the distant chirp of crickets replaced by an uneasy silence. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her stomach nodding for a reason she couldn't name. She counted them again, the way she always did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, and yet, a flicker of movement caught her eye in the periphery, a shadow that didn't belong to the trees or her friends. She spun around, but the path behind them was empty. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, must be tired." By the time they set up camp, the unease had nestled into Sarah's chest, refusing to leave. The fire crackled, its warmth a weak barrier against the encroaching darkness. As they ate and talked, Sarah felt it again, that invisible weight, like someone standing just outside the circle of firelight, watching. When she looked over her shoulder, all she saw was the impenetrable black of the woods. But when she counted them again, her breath caught in her throat. 6. She blinked hard, counting once more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just 5. "Something wrong?" Jake asked, noticing her pale expression. Sarah forced a smile. "No, nothing, just thought I saw something." But even as she tried to dismiss the thought, she couldn't shake the sensation. A presence just out of reach, just beyond the light. The fire popped and the shadows danced, but Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that someone was standing in the dark, waiting. The next morning, the forest was alive with sunlight, and the unease of the night before felt like a bad dream. Sarah shook off her discomfort, determined not to let her imagination spoil the trip. As the group packed their gear and started down the trail, their chatter resumed, though there was an undercurrent of tension Sarah couldn't ignore. The path became steeper, winding through dense underbrush. Jake darted ahead, his camera clicking as he captured beams of light piercing through the canopy. Mark stayed close to him, occasionally teasing about the number of photos Jake took. Emily and Lisa lingered at the back, their voices low, sharing stories that drifted like whispers in the trees. Sarah stayed in the middle, her instincts urging her to keep an eye on everyone. She found herself counting again, almost compulsively. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her lips moved silently with each number. It wasn't until they paused for a break that the first crack appeared in their camaraderie. "Where's my water bottle?" Mark rummaged through his pack, frowning. "I know I packed it." "You probably left it at the campsite," Emily said, offering him hers. "No, I didn't." Mark's tone sharpened. "I packed it this morning." "Maybe you dropped it," Jake offered, glancing at his gear. Sarah didn't speak, her stomach twisting. She knew Mark wasn't careless. It wasn't like him to forget something so important. But before she could voice her thoughts, Lisa interrupted. "Did anyone notice?" She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between the others. "Never mind." "Notice what?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Lisa swallowed. "It's stupid, but last night when we were sitting by the fire, I swear I saw someone behind us. just for a second. But when I looked again, they were gone. The group fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a cloud. It was probably just your imagination, Emily said gently, though her expression betrayed her unease. Or an animal, Jake added, trying to sound casual. There's a lot of wildlife out here. Yeah, maybe, Lisa murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. They pressed on, though the cheerful banter from earlier was replaced by nervous glances and tense silence. The trail narrowed, the trees crowding closer as if the forest itself were conspiring against them. The sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the walls of green. By the time they stopped for lunch, Sarah's nerves were fraying. She tried to focus on her sandwich, but her gaze kept drifting to the edge of the clearing where the shadows seemed to move on their own. Then it happened again. Let's do a quick head count, Sarah said abruptly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Why? We're all here, Jake said, raising an eyebrow. Humor me. Her voice was firmer than she intended. They lined up, grinning at the absurdity of it, but as Sarah counted, her heart sank. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Her breath caught. She counted again 5. Something wrong? Emily asked, concern etched on her face. Sarah shook her head, forcing a smile. Nothing, just being thorough. But it wasn't nothing. Each time she counted, for a split second, there was an extra figure in her mind, a shadowy shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The afternoon wore on, the group growing quieter, their steps slower. Jake's camera hung unused around his neck. Lisa scribbled furiously in her notebook, her usual calm replaced by jittery movements. Mark stayed at the front, his competitive edge dulled, while Emily kept looking over her shoulder, as if she too felt the unseen eyes. When they finally reached their next campsite, night was already falling. The group worked quickly to set up, their usual chatter replaced by curt instructions. The fire was lit, but its warmth felt inadequate against the chill that had settled over them. As they sat around the flames, Sarah noticed something strange. The seating arrangement seemed off, the gaps between them uneven. It felt as if the circle had widened to accommodate one more. She didn't say anything, but her pulse quickened. And then the noises began. At first it was subtle, rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig. The group froze, their eyes darting to the dark edges of the forest. Probably just animals, Jake said, though his voice trembled. The sounds grew louder, closer, footsteps, human footsteps. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense foliage. There's no one there, Emily whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. But Sarah knew better. She could feel it now, the same sensation she'd had the night before, an unseen presence, just out of reach. When she looked around the circle again, her heart stopped. There was no mistake. They were 6. The firelight flickered, and Sarah swore she saw a figure sitting among them, its face shrouded in shadow. When she blinked, it was gone. The morning arrived heavy with an unnatural stillness. Even the forest seemed reluctant to stir, the usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves eerily absent. Sarah woke to find the others already up, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. Lisa sat by the dying embers of the fire, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sitting down beside her. Lisa hesitated, then opened the notebook to a page filled with frantic scribbles. "I found this in my bag last night." Sarah frowned, leaning closer. The handwriting was messy but familiar. Lisa's. The entries were dated exactly 1 year ago. "I didn't write this," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Not during this trip." "What does it say?" Mark asked, joining them, his usual bravado replaced by unease. Lisa's voice shook as she read aloud. "Ben said the trail doesn't feel right. He wants to turn back, but no one's listening. We keep joking that there's room for one more." The group exchanged confused, alarmed looks. "Who's Ben?" Jake asked. "We don't know anyone named Ben." Lisa flipped through more pages, her breathing quickening. "There's more. It talks about him, about all of us. These are things I would never write, things I don't remember." Emily leaned forward, her face pale. Maybe you're misremembering? Stress can do weird things." "No," Lisa's voice cracked. "I never wrote this." Sarah took to the notebook, scanning the entries. The words painted a haunting picture of another trip, another group of 6, walking the same trail. The entries became more erratic as they described Ben's increasing fear and the group's dismissal of his concerns. The final entry read, Ben's gone. We looked everywhere, but it's like the trail swallowed him. The count keeps coming up 6. I can't stay here. Silence settled over them, broken only by the distant sound of the wind through the trees. Do you think, Emily hesitated, her voice trembling, do you think this could be from another group? Someone who was here before us? It's your handwriting, Sarah said quietly, though she could hardly believe the words herself. Maybe there's someone out here messing with us, Jake suggested, his voice rising. Some lunatic trying to scare hikers. That would explain the noises, the missing stuff, the 6th person. Then where's Ben? Mark snapped, his frustration boiling over. If this is some sick joke, where's the guy they wrote about? No one had an answer. Determined to make sense of the growing nightmare, Sarah led the group back to the clearing where they'd first felt something was wrong. As they walked, every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant crack of branches. The forest felt alive, but not in the way it should. It was watching them. When they reached the clearing, Lisa gasped. Her journal wasn't the only thing waiting for them. There, half buried in the dirt, was a tattered backpack. The fabric was faded and torn, the name Ben scrawled on a tag near the zipper. Jake knelt to pick it up, pulling out its contents. A water bottle, a compass, and a map marked with their exact trail. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the air between them thick with dread. This can't be real, Emily whispered. But it was, and the unease turned to terror as they flipped the map over and found a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. There's no way out. He won't let you leave. That night, back at camp, they tried to make sense of what they'd found. The fire crackled weakly, its light casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. It's not a ghost, Mark said firmly, as though trying to convince himself. This is all explainable. It has to be. Then explain it, Sarah challenged, her voice tight with fear. The journal, the bag, the fact that we're all seeing someone who isn't there. No one spoke. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and then they heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the camp. Sarah grabbed the flashlight, her hand shaking, and shone it into the darkness. Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low and distant, echoed through the trees. Room for one more. The group froze. The words didn't sound like any of them, and yet they were familiar, as if spoken by someone they should know. The fire flickered violently, nearly going out, and in the dim light Sarah saw it, just for a second, a figure standing at the edge of the camp, its face obscured, its body barely more than a shadow. She blinked, and it was gone. Did you see that? Jake whispered, his voice cracking. They all nodded. The pieces were coming together, but they were pieces no one wanted to understand. The 6th figure wasn't just in their minds. It was real, tied to the trail, tied to Ben. And if the journal was right, they were running out of time. The oppressive tension thickened. The group struggled to process the day's events. Night had come again, and the forest closed in tighter, a suffocating presence pressing against them from all sides. The campfire burned low, its weak flames casting jittery, uneven light over their pale faces. No one spoke. Even whispers seemed dangerous, as if the unseen presence might hear and respond. Sarah broke the silence. We need to go back to where this all started, to where Ben disappeared. Are you serious? Mark snapped, his voice unsteady. You want to walk deeper into this, whatever this is? If we stay here, it won't stop. Sarah countered, her voice firm but trembling. We've all felt it. We're being watched, followed. If we don't confront it, we'll end up like Ben. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. One by one, the others nodded. There was no safe option, only the illusion of choice. The group packed quickly, their movements mechanical, driven by fear and desperation. The trail to the spot Lisa's journal described, where Ben was last seen, was steep and overgrown, the path long since reclaimed by the forest. The moon provided faint light, but every shadow seemed alive. Every rustle in the leaves a whisper in the dark. Halfway there, they stopped. I can't do this, Emily said, her voice shaking as she clutched her knees. I feel like we're walking into a trap. Keep moving, Jake urged, though he sounded as if he were trying to convince himself. Then came the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, pacing just out of sight. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her breath catching. "Set up your camera." Jake fumbled with his gear, his hands trembling as he mounted the camera on a tripod and pointed it toward the trail behind them. He pressed record, and the red light blinked on, a fragile promise of answers. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was their breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, from the direction of the camera, came a voice. "You shouldn't have come back." The group spun around, but the trail was empty. Nothing moved in the shadows. Nothing visible, at least. "What the hell was that?" Mark hissed, backing closer to the group. Jake grabbed the camera and played the footage back. The screen showed the 5 of them huddled together on the trail, their faces pale and frightened. And behind them, just for a moment, a figure stepped into view. Tall and shadowy, its features obscured, it stood watching them before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered, tears streaming down her face. When they finally reached the clearing where Ben had disappeared, the air was thick and unnaturally still. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the group as if to pull them closer. In the center of the clearing, the earth was disturbed, the soil loose and dark as if something or someone had recently been there. "This is it," Lisa said, clutching her notebook like a talisman. "This is where it happened." Sarah knelt by the disturbed ground, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she expected to find, but the weight of the clearing pressed down on her, demanding acknowledgement. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah swallowed hard. We have to let him go. Whatever's keeping him here, we have to make it right." "Make it right how?" Mark asked, his voice breaking. "He's not here. He's gone," Lisa finished quietly, her gaze fixed on the disturbed ground. But not all the way. They stood in a circle, their flashlights casting long shadows over the clearing. Sarah led them in a quiet tribute, each of them speaking into the stillness, acknowledging Ben's presence, his fear, his loss. "We're sorry," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We should have listened. We should have looked harder. We're so sorry." As the words left her mouth, the forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. But then the footsteps returned. They came closer this time, deliberate and heavy. The group froze, their flashlights trained on the trees. And then he appeared. It was Ben, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his body flickering like a bad signal. He looked at them, not with anger but with sorrow, his mouth opening as if to speak. "We're sorry," Sarah repeated, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to leave you." Ben tilted his head, his expression unreadable, and then slowly he began to fade. The sixth presence, the weight that had followed them since the start of their trip, lifted. When he was gone, the group collapsed to the ground, overcome by relief and exhaustion. They counted one last time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only 5. The group staggered out of the forest at dawn, their faces pale and drawn, their movements mechanical. The soft morning light painted the trailhead in warm hues, but no one felt its comfort. Pine Ridge National Park stood behind them, an unyielding wall of trees that seemed to watch their every step, as if ensuring they left for good. They had made it out, all 5 of them. Sarah led the way to the parking lot, where their cars waited like anchors to the real world. The moment her foot hit the gravel, she collapsed onto the hood of her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jake followed suit, his camera still hanging from his neck, though he hadn't touched it since they'd left the clearing. No one spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't born of relief. It was the kind of silence that comes when the truth is too heavy to carry aloud. The drive back to town was subdued, the hum of tires on asphalt the only sound. Sarah kept replaying the night in her mind, the journal, the backpack, Ben's face in the clearing. Every detail etched itself into her thoughts, refusing to fade. At the diner where they stopped for breakfast, the group sat at a booth in the far corner. The waitress gave them a curious look as she poured their coffee. "Rough weekend?" she asked, her tone light. No one answered. "5 checks?" she asked, glancing around the table. Sarah's chest tightened at the question. She forced herself to nod. "Yeah, 5. The waitress didn't seem to notice her hesitation. She walked away, leaving them with plates of untouched food. It was Lisa who finally broke the silence, her voice barely audible. "Do you think he's at peace now?" "I hope so," Sarah said, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. "We did everything we could, But why now? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Why us? What made him come back this time? Jake looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Maybe it wasn't just him. Maybe it was us. Our fear, our guilt. Something about being there brought him back, or kept him there. Do you think it's over? Mark asked, his voice quiet but firm. Or will he stay out there waiting? No one had an answer. Back home, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at a blank document on her laptop. She needed to write about what had happened, to process it, to warn others, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she tried, she saw Ben's face in the clearing, heard his footsteps in the dark. The only thing she could type was a title, Room for One More, The Unseen Dangers of Pine Ridge Trail. She wrote about the forest's beauty, the camaraderie of friends setting out on a hike. She wrote about the first signs of unease, the counting, the presence that refused to be ignored. But when it came to Ben, she faltered. How could she explain him? How could she make others believe that he was real, that the sixth presence had been more than a trick of the mind? Finally, she closed the laptop. Maybe some stories weren't meant to be told in full. The group stayed in touch for a while, meeting for coffee, exchanging texts. But as the weeks turned into months, the bonds forged in terror began to fade. The shared experience was too heavy, the memories too raw. Each of them carried their own piece of the story, a burden they couldn't fully share or let go of. Lisa stopped hiking altogether, her notebook abandoned in a drawer. Jake poured himself into his photography but avoided the woods. Mark took up running in the city, the pounding of his feet on pavement, a reminder that he was far from the forest. Emily threw herself into her work, her usual warmth dulled by an edge of anxiety she couldn't shake. And Sarah never stopped counting. At grocery stores, in meetings, in quiet moments at home, she counted people wherever she went, her heart skipping a beat when the numbers didn't match. Months later, Sarah returned to Pine Ridge, unable to resist the pull of the forest. She told herself it was closure, a way to reclaim her love of hiking, but the truth was simpler. She needed to see it again. The trailhead was deserted. The forest felt different now, quieter, less menacing. She walked for hours, retracing their steps, until she reached the clearing. The disturbed ground had smoothed over, the trees standing as silent witnesses. As she turned to leave, she felt it again, that faint, familiar weight. The air seemed to thicken, and for just a moment she thought she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't count. But when she reached her car, she swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching her. And for the first time, she realized the count had never been 5. It had always been 6. Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could for 5 people who had walked the edge of something they couldn't fully understand. But for each of them, the experience at Pine Ridge Trail left scars, the kind that weren't visible but festered in quiet moments, in dreams, and in the dark corners of their minds. For Sarah, the counting never stopped. It wasn't conscious, it was reflexive. At the office, she would glance at her team during a meeting, her mind whispering numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? The numbers always corrected themselves when she looked closer, but the hesitation haunted her. Her nights were the worst. She often woke to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, just outside her bedroom door. She would sit up, heart pounding, straining to hear, but the house would fall silent. One night she found dirt on her floor, just a small patch near the doorframe, as if someone had walked through with muddy shoes. She cleaned it up, convincing herself it had been tracked in earlier. But when she turned off the lights, she swore she heard a voice, low and distant, whisper, "Room for one more." Lisa tried to forget. She buried herself in fiction, using her writing to escape from the reality of what had happened. But the stories she wrote began to take on a life of their own. Unbidden, they turned dark, haunting tales of lost hikers, of figures in the shadows, of voices calling from empty trails. Her dreams were worse. Every night she was back in the forest, her notebook in hand, recording the same phrase over and over. The count was wrong, the count was wrong. One morning she woke to find her old journal sitting on her desk, the journal from the trip. She had thrown it away, burned it even, desperate to rid herself of its eerie entries. Yet there it was, pristine and untouched. When she flipped it open, the pages were blank, except for one. "You never really left." Lisa didn't leave her apartment for a week after that. Jake's camera became his enemy. Every time he picked it up, he thought about the footage he'd captured in the forest, the shadowy figure standing behind them, the faint outline of something they couldn't explain. He deleted the files, but the memory of them lingered. And when he tried to shoot new photos, strange things began to appear in his images. A shadow where there should have been none. A figure in the distance that disappeared when he zoomed in. One day, he printed a series of landscape shots, determined to focus on the beauty of the world. But when he laid them out on his table, his breath caught. In every photo, faint and blurry, but unmistakable, was the outline of a man, always standing just at the edge of the frame, watching. Jake stopped taking pictures after that. Emily threw herself into her work, helping others as a way to push her own fears aside. But even in the brightly lit hospital where she worked, she couldn't escape the shadows of Pine Ridge. One night as she was closing up, she heard footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She turned, expecting to see a colleague, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. Later, when she checked her locker, she found a single piece of folded paper inside. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "Don't look back." Mark tried to rationalize everything. He told himself it was mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by stress and fear. He even sought out online forums, posting vague accounts of their experience to see if anyone else had encountered something similar. One night, he received a reply. The message was simple. The count is always 6. He tried to respond, but the account was gone. No username, no history, just that single message. The next day, while running in the city, Mark stopped at a crosswalk and glanced at his reflection in a storefront window. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing behind him. A man, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. Mark turned, but the street was empty. Though the group drifted apart, their shared experience tied them together in ways they couldn't escape. Each of them carried the weight of that sixth presence, the knowledge that they had brushed against something inexplicable and malevolent. Despite their distance, they all began to notice the same unsettling pattern. Every so often, they would see the number 6 on receipts, in random texts, on clocks that read 6:06. It wasn't just a number anymore. It was a warning, a reminder. The world seemed quieter after Pine Ridge, as if a shadow had fallen over their lives. And in that quiet, they all felt it. The footsteps, the presence, the whisper of a voice they couldn't forget. Room for one more. Months passed, but Pine Ridge Trail never let go of them. The group, scattered across their separate lives, continued to feel its pull, a haunting reminder of what they had faced and the questions that remained unanswered. Each tried to move on, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the sixth presence wasn't truly gone. It lingered, waiting. One sleepless night, Sarah found herself scrolling through old photos from the trip, her chest tightening with every image. The group smiling at the trailhead, the campfire glowing against the dark woods. In every photo, her eyes searched the background, expecting, almost needing, to see him. Then she saw it. In the last photo Jake had taken, a candid shot of the group as they packed up their final camp, there was a shadow. Faint but distinct, it stood just behind her, its outline impossibly human. Her breath caught, her hands trembling as she zoomed in. The shadow was watching her, its gaze fixed and unyielding. The next morning, she made her decision. She had to go back. Sarah didn't tell the others. She didn't think they'd understand or that they'd come. She arrived at Pine Ridge just as the sun was rising, the familiar trailhead bathed in golden light. This time, there was no excitement, no camaraderie, only the cold knot of fear in her stomach. As she retraced their steps, the forest seemed different. The air was heavier, the shadows longer. The familiar landmarks felt distorted, as if the trail had shifted in her absence. And yet, she pressed on, driven by a need she couldn't fully explain. She reached the clearing just as dusk began to fall. The air was still, the silence oppressive. Sarah stood in the center, her heart pounding. "I'm here," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing had happened. Then from the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was him, Ben. His face was clearer this time, his features sharper but still flickering, as though caught between worlds. He didn't speak, but his eyes bore into hers, filled with a mix of sorrow and accusation. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to leave you." Ben tilted his head as if considering her words. Then he raised a hand and pointed to the ground. Following his gesture, Sarah knelt and began digging with her hands. The soil was loose and damp, and within minutes her fingers scraped something solid. She froze, her breath catching, as she uncovered a rusted metal tin, the kind used to store personal belongings. Inside, she found a photo of Ben and his group. There were 6 of them, smiling and carefree, standing at the very same trailhead. She flipped the photo over and found a single word scrawled in messy handwriting. Stay. A wave of understanding washed over her. Ben's group had been 6, until one disappeared. And then another. The trail didn't just claim people, it kept them. It was a trap, a place where fear and guilt fed something older, something darker. Sarah looked up, but Ben was gone. In his place, the forest seemed to shift, the shadows retreating slightly as if appeased. She stood, clutching the tin, and whispered, "I'll tell them. I'll warn them." The clearing grew quiet, the oppressive air lifting just enough for her to breathe. Back home, Sarah wrote furiously, detailing every moment of their trip, every clue they had missed, every eerie sensation. Her words spilled onto the page, raw and unfiltered. She titled the account, "There are only 5 of us on this trip. We keep counting 6." She posted it online, sharing it in hiking forums and local blogs. The story spread quickly, a mix of intrigue and disbelief. Some dismissed it as fiction, but others claimed to have experienced similar phenomena at Pine Ridge. Missing items, unease, the sensation of being watched. Weeks later, Sarah received an email with no subject line and no sender. The message was only 2 words: "Thank you." The group didn't reunite. The experience was too much, the memories too raw. But each of them, in their own way, kept track of the story as it spread, waiting for something, an answer, a resolution, a sign. Months turned to years, and Pine Ridge faded from the public's attention. But Sarah, Jake, Lisa, Mark, and Emily carried it with them, always. They counted obsessively, avoided shadows, and never hiked alone again. And every now and then, one of them would feel it, a familiar weight, a fleeting shadow, the faint echo of footsteps in the night. They would tell themselves it was nothing, that the 6th presence was gone. But deep down, they knew the truth. Some trails never end.